Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 11 today after David has called Uriah back from the front to try to get him to have sex with Bathsheba, who's pregnant by David, but Uriah is too good an Israelite and too loyal to his people and to his boss Joab to do that. And so what's David to do next? And that's where we pick up the story in verse 12, as you can see on the left side of the screen. So if you haven't watched the introductory video for this unit, I really encourage you to do so, where I go over a number of the issues in chapters 11 and 12, and here are some of them listed here. We went over these overall in the introductory video, and we've been following through these as we go. And now we're in this section down here, and although there are many other questions that we'll look at in here, this is at least an outline of some of the many gaps in this chapter. And I've been highlighting that throughout, that for all the drama of this, as Sarah Koenig nicely calls it, the sex and murder scandal injected into David's reign, there are so many questions that we cannot answer. Some of them we can, and some of them are answered later in the text. Like last time we noted the mystery of Uriah saying his Lord was Joab, and not David, and not Yahweh directly. And you can see that on the left side of the screen in verse 11. So there are some things that can get answered, but intentions and what they're thinking in these situations cannot. And so although one way we could go through verses 12 to 15 really quickly, because there's not that much to look at in terms of the number of words or the mysteries of the language, I want to do it slowly here so that we can just pause and be with what the authors are doing in running over this and not allowing us to pause and focus on the emotions of a man taking his own death warrant to the front to be assassinated at the behest of his king. So those are some of the issues. We've been looking at this structure throughout, and I note a structure, and we'll look today at how Fackelman, who has read these books in incredible detail, 4 volumes full of detailed commentary in the books of Samuel, highlights a little different shape, and that's fine. There's not one right answer. He will focus this unit on verse 14, and I think that's fair enough, as we can see over here. Once David turns, or the text turns to the letter he wrote, it's separate from his relationship with Uriah directly, and now it's his relationship with Joab. So he could have made this 6 to 13 and this 14 to 25, but in any event, you can see how the whole thing is framed around the question of the war with the Ammonites and the mention of Jerusalem only in the beginning and the end, and of Rabbah, the place where the battle is going on, the siege of Rabbah, again in both places. And so in this section, here's where Fackelman suggests this kind of complex chiastic shape, the overall chiasm, and then in the D part of the A, B, C, D, C, B, A chiasm, is this very detailed phrase-by-phrase chiasm that really only covers 2.5 verses. And it's not exactly precise, but you can see how it is symmetrical. And that's certainly to highlight that this encounter between David and Joab and the response there is telling us something about the relationship with the king and his general and what Joab's role is in this situation. And Joab will continue to have this role, as we'll see in the Absalom situation, when he sides with David, even though the people have sided with Absalom. And some of that may have to do with, as we looked at last time, the idea from Michelle Gilmore that what's at stake in these chapters, or not only the chapters we're looking at here, but in this whole section of 2 Samuel, including Absalom's rebellion, are 2 different ways of understanding monarchy. The so-called southern way, focused in Judah, which David represents, around a central place and a royal palace and an army that does the will of the king from Jerusalem, and at Yahweh's behest, and the northern way, which will be embodied by Absalom and later by Jeroboam after the rebellion in 1 Kings 11 and 12 and following, which is decentralized and relies on popular support. And we'll see that one of the concerns we see parenthetically when we get there is Jeroboam is concerned about losing the people. His question isn't losing Yahweh, his question is losing the people. So is monarchy based on the popular understanding and popular support and decentralized, or is it based on Yahweh's approval and is it highly centralized? That's one of the arguments that the Israelites and the Judahites argued with throughout the monarchy and after the monarchy as well. And of course, in the event Absalom's rebellion is put down, but that doesn't mean that's the author's approval. We may well see that David and Joab are hardened people in terms of being willing to kill and being willing to lie and being willing to do whatever they need to do to hold on to the power that's given them a good position. But to reach that kind of judgment, we're going to have to continue through the story. So as we look at the key words that we've been doing here, we were in this section, and we're in this section here, and we're overlapping some of these paragraphs just in terms of how much I think I can reasonably do in the length of a video here. But we see that Joab is the key character here. David continues to be, and as I've been noting throughout these videos, David is rarely referred to as king. In fact, I'd like to go back to something that I didn't mention last time, as I talked about this present that follows as if it was like the ark, but I didn't focus on the fact that the present is named from the king. and not from David. And so that's one of the rare places we see it here on the right side. And we'll see it one more time in verse 19. We won't look at it this video, we'll look at it next time, where something is happening from the royal position. So this is not a present from David. This is a present from the king. And notice how it's not King David as such. It's just simply the king. So David remains in that role, even though we see him face to face with Uriah, starting in our verse here. And that's where we are. So let's continue right there. And as we do, I'd like to just, before we start, like to note something interesting about what's happening in this unit, very different from everything else we've seen. I've noted in the introductory video and a couple earlier videos where it was relevant around these verses, the curious element of passing of time in these two chapters, because plainly at least something like 2 years has to go by for the two pregnancies, and yet there are these huge gaps in the record. For example, it just went from one verse from David having sex with Bathsheba and her purifying himself to her telling him he's pregnant, which obviously had to take, as my chart shows, a couple of months. And plainly we'll see at the end of this chapter when Bathsheba has the child, she has to complete the pregnancy. But in our little unit here, we have quite a bit of attention to the passing of time. And if I put our verses up here on the screen, as you can see, with the time elements noted separately, you can really see how they're concentrated here. Today and tomorrow and evening and morning, really highlighting on the focus of David and Uriah in this tense situation, and what is David going to do? And when is Uriah going to begin to start asking questions? And the answer is he's not going to, but that's where we're at. So let's leave our questions up here, and we'll see. Right now we're around the question, continuing the question of what do we imagine Uriah knows, and what do we imagine David thinks Uriah knows, especially after Uriah has given this very patriotic and loyal speech about while his men are at battle, he wouldn't dare to have the pleasure of having sex with his wife, and slept at the entrance of the palace with the men of his lord, but to say the other soldiers of Joab who seemingly came back with him or were there to guard the royal palace. We don't know about that. So David says this to him here, and notice how he's immediately we hear he's lying. Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink, but in the morning, so another whole day has gone by, and it's plain that when David made him drunk, he certainly wasn't going to send him back the 55-mile march all the way back to Rabbah while he was drunk. So plainly, David's plan all along was to try it again and to get him drunk and see if getting him drunk would do it. So we see already David's willing to lie directly to him. Why? Why would he not just say, hang around for a couple of days? We see throughout the Bible that it's very common for people who are visiting people in a hospitality situation to be asked to stay a little longer. Why don't you stay and have another meal and take your time, as just a sense of not wanting to feel like you're pushing people out the door. But this isn't just hospitality. Uriah wasn't just on a journey and David happened to help him out before he went on. David summoned him as the king to get a report, officially, to get a report on the war. And what's he going to be sending him back for, other than to get back to the soldiers? So there apparently is no reason to have him stick around, since he's already gotten his report. He already knows that Uriah has refused to sleep with his wife. So he has to at least be suggesting to Uriah that there's no funny business going on, that it's too late in the day to go back now, so I'll send you back tomorrow. Notice he doesn't suggest that Uriah can go on his own. It's a matter of him sending him or not sending him. And David exerts that kind of power throughout, whether he's called king or not, by sending messengers and telling Joab what to do, etc. So he's exerting that kind of authority over Uriah, but he's not quite getting what he wants yet. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day, and on the next day, really highlighting that there, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence. And as my note below says, where's Bathsheba while David is doing all this? I noted last time that when Uriah got into Jerusalem, as far as we can tell, he went directly to see David. And now a day has gone by, and as far as we know, he has not seen his wife. He hasn't heard from her, he hasn't seen her, hasn't given her a hug or anything. And as far as we can tell, he does not. But does she know what David's planning? That's another whole set of knowledge questions I could have put here on the right side of the chart. What does Bathsheba know in all this? She certainly knows she's pregnant, but that's the last thing we've heard from her. So we don't know if she approves of David's plan to cover this up or not. And we certainly don't know if she approves of the plan that's going to unfold here. First, the drunken attempt to get him to have sex with his wife again, and then what follows. So the language is straightforward here. David invited him to eat and drink in his presence, or literally in or before his face, which will play out in the letter that David sends to Joab about the face. We'll see that next time. And made him drunk. And we have to recognize this is in the middle of the day. We don't know what time of day, but sometime later it was evening. And so he's having him over and making him drunk, but we don't hear that David is drunk. And as my note below suggests, there's a certain cynicism there in David getting this guy drunk, but not getting himself drunk. And what must Uriah be thinking at this point? That his king has invited him in and asked him to stay the next day, and now is getting him drunk in the middle of the day. He certainly knows that he's not going back to the fighting on that day. And why would he not refuse to get drunk? If he refused to have sex with his wife, you might think that he refused to get drunk too. We don't know the details there, whether David compels him. It says he made him drunk, although it doesn't necessarily imply force. That just suggests the passive voice there that he got drunk, but through somebody else's agency. And that's all we know. So in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch. Notice the exact opposite of how our story started, with it was evening and David arose from his couch, suggesting indolence or something else, that he was just on his couch, or his bed as it could be translated, until evening. Now, in the more appropriate behavior, Uriah is going to lie in his bed in the evening, but out there with the servants of the Lord. Now that answers one of the questions that we had previously, was he just lying on the ground, and what's the situation? So now the text tells us that he has some kind of a bed. Certainly don't picture this as a four-poster or some kind of mattress like we have. It's almost certainly just a mat and something he could roll up with him and probably carry with him. So he's got something to sleep on, and he's still out there with the slaves of his lord, but to just say Joab. And so his loyalty remains with Joab there, and yet, as we'll see, David's about to appeal to Joab as the agent of Uriah's assassination. And we're told again he did not go down to his house, and I was noting last time, but it's worth repeating, how the writer just insists on that over and over and over again, 4 explicit times in this section here, and then even out of his own mouth, I will not do such a thing. So this is the last of the 4 times to make clear we already know that Uriah is not the father of the child, so we don't need to keep hearing that probably. And that there's any ostensible idea that having sex with her now could cover it up. She's already more pregnant, you would think, than having sex with her now would be able to cover up anyway, but we don't know that detail. But in any event, he won't do it. So overnight, David has to come up with another plan. And we don't know, did he have the plan already? The in the morning seems to suggest that David spent the night trying to figure out what to do. Otherwise, why couldn't he have not written the letter immediately at the night before? And notice how calmly the narrator presents this, as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. No comment is necessary from the narrator in terms of any kind of editorial comment. And my note there just shows the chiasm I showed you. So David wrote a letter, and there's a couple interesting things here. This is the only act of writing in the entire books of Samuel. And one thing that people often assume wrongly is that because David's a leader, that would mean he was literate. But it's almost certainly the case that he was not literate. As a shepherd boy, there's no reason to think that he was. And one of the reasons that kings have people known in English, at least as scribes, as sophatim in Hebrew, is to have someone with the technical skill of writing to be able to do that kind of thing for them. That's not just true in the Jerusalem-centered monarchy of David, but throughout the ancient world. That writing was one skill that kings were not necessarily expected to have. They'd have a scribe or a secretary to do that for them. That may well be the case here, but suggesting David did it himself, much like the tradition suggests that David wrote Psalms and did many other things like that. And as the propagandist of Solomon will suggest that Solomon was a man of many talents as well. So some of it may be just suggesting David can do all things. Maybe David was literate, but it's unlikely. But immediately he writes a letter to Joab, and before we hear the content, he sent it by the hand of Uriah. So we hear this act is being done before we get the inside view of the letter. I just want to pause for a moment on Joab. Joab is David's guy, and we saw earlier in this book how when Abner sought to intrude upon David's relationship with Joab and insert himself there after the death of Saul, Joab had everything straightened up and realized what Abner was about and had Abner killed. Later in the book, we'll see that when Absalom's rebellion is there and some of David's people side with Absalom, thinking that's the way it's going, Joab stubbornly stays with David and will be the one to dispatch Absalom, leaving David to the poignant and mixed response, "Absalom, my son, oh my son, Absalom," in front of all the people. So Joab is his guy to get this kind of stuff taken care of. And he will get it taken care of here with no questions asked. And not only with no questions asked, but with his own improvement on the strategy to help the king get away with it even more. And here's the content of the faithful letter. Notice the narrator gives us inside knowledge here. There's no way that this letter would have been public information. And we can only imagine that Joab would report it to some chronicler later. That seems pretty unlikely, doesn't it? So this is the inside look from the writer here. In the letter he wrote, simply this, and we have to imagine how Joab heard this, that he's taking one of his leading men and doing this. Set Uriah in the forefront, or literally in the front of the face of the fighting. And that's the point I was trying to make about David inviting him to eat and drink in his face. And here's the friendly, hospitable way to be in the face, to eat and drink and get drunk. And here's in the face of the hardest of the fighting. And then draw back from him. And as Sternberg notes, this element is not followed by Joab, who recognizes more than the king that for the plan to work, Uriah's death must not be too obvious, or he simply could have been killed in Jerusalem. The point plainly being that David is not thinking like a good warrior here. If he draws back, everyone will see that Joab is arranging it for Uriah to be murdered. And so Joab doesn't want to do that for his own sake, to have the solidarity with his other soldiers, but also not for David's sake, whom he served. And as I was noting in the issues we were looking at, as far as we know, and there's no reason to think otherwise, Joab does not know about the whole Bathsheba business unless there's some hint in previous behavior, which the story doesn't report, that David had a hanking for Bathsheba, or Bathsheba had ambitions to be connected with the royal court. We'll see when she reappears again in 1 Kings, she's got the prophet Nathan on her side to make sure that Solomon becomes king in the face of Adonijah's attempt to usurp the throne from his dying father. And so she does have solidarity there, whether it's because of her power or because she's a tool for Nathan, we don't know then, and we certainly don't know yet now. So this is David's plan, to have him draw back so that he may be struck down and die. And notice there's no subtlety here. David does not couch it in ambiguities or in euphemisms like he did about go wash your feet in terms of having sex with his wife and addressed to Uriah and the previous evening. He just tells Joab straightforwardly what's going on. What can Joab imagine is the reason for this? As far as we know, Uriah has not ever done anything wrong in the fighting, and Joab would be the one to know that. He's listed among the 30 at the end of the book, and that's connected here as well to what Joab does. It says he assigned him to the place for the valiant warriors, and I guess I'm going to finish this verse now since I already started it. The men of power matches what we saw in 1 Samuel 31, but also what we're going to see here among the 30. So it's Uriah's own people, to the extent that they were a group that worked together and not just individuals who got accolades separately and put in this list of the 30. We don't know that, but he's certainly among the people or the fellow valiant warriors, and some of them are going to have to die in order for the king's will to be carried out. So might as well finish the verse here, as he was besieging the city in the translation, but literally was watching and gave. So that's exactly what's happening here, and as Alter notes, Joab coldly recognizes that in order to give David's plan some credibility, it will be necessary to send a whole contingent into a dangerous place and for many others beside Uriah to die. As Falkelman notes, the eastern front, the site of the action in verses 16 to 21, is framed by the palace as site of action in verse 14 and in verses 22 and 25. And then finally we have down here from Halvorson and Holmes, who, as I've noted before, are reading this from a political science perspective. In order to protect his own authority and standing with the troops, Joab had to sacrifice more soldiers than David had originally contemplated. By sharing the risks of combat, he was presumably better able to stage manage the situation and ensure that Uriah would not survive. In other words, Joab's good at his job, and David knew that, and without asking any questions or without talking to Uriah, without anything about how was it in Jerusalem, Joab will carry out the will of his master. And we'll see what happens with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.